In this video you're going to see the game between Anish, Giri and Dmitry Andreikin from the semifinals of Game 1 in the Grand Prix in Belgrade. The opening was Sicilian. We had the one with e6. And now Giri played b3 on the third move, which is very rarely played. Andreikin plays b6. It's also possible to go for d6 or for knight c6, but he chose this. Now Giri continues normally, and we have knight c3, knight f6 by Andreikin, e5, and now knight e4. Giri took, and now queen e2 first. Now the c2 pawn is off limits because there's d3 and losing the bishop. He went back to b7, and now h4, trying to get some space on the king side to stop any counterplay with g5 as well. Now knight c6 and h5. In this position black has some issues because it's not clear where to castle. Because now with this king side being pushed with h4, h5, there is always some threat of knight g5. Every time you castle on the queen side, it's a problem. White wants to go rook h3, rook g3 at some point, and to put pressure on g7, keeping the bishop on f8, or provoking g6, which might even make further weaknesses. So here Andreikin plays knight b4, trying to provoke some moves, some weakening moves on the queen side. Now white cannot just castle, because in that case he would lose a pawn on a2, and after that a5 comes and it's much easier to attack. d4 was interesting, but I think that after this capturing, going here, rook c8, let's say c4 and queen g5, black has a decent play. White cannot castle, black is going to move his bishop from f8, and it's a very good position for black. But Giri here chose to play d3 first, not to open up the center just yet, because in that case black would use it to his advantage, like in the previous line you saw. If black tries to take on f3 right now and go for queen g5 like after d4, and now it's different because after a6, knight c6, there is queen e4 followed by f4. Also, I think that knight d5 doesn't change much because you can also go queen e4 and bishop c1 if you need to control the f4 square. So after this, Andreikin tried with b5. He slowly prepares for some queenside action, and first Giri goes for a3, knight goes back to c6, and now queen d2. The reason why he does this is he needs to open up the bishop. The bishop was trapped on f1, and now Andreikin decides not to castle, just to play rook c8. So queenside castle is off the limits. The only way he can castle now is on the king side, but it would make his position less flexible. And now rook h3. Typical rook lift in this position because there's plenty of space. It's aimed against bishop e7. White just wants to go rook g3 on the next move and stop any development by black. Queen c7, and now he castled finally. And Andreikin plays knight a5. Probably just trying to push c4 at some point and to open up the queen side, but I think he overestimates his chances on the queen side. Here the better move was knight d4, targeting the knight on f3. What does white do here? If he moves the knight, then black achieved something. He's going to capture on e5, and it's a very good position. Bishop f3 also might come with capturing on e5. So let's say if black captures on d4, cd, now you cannot capture back because of bishop a3, and after king b1, it seems like black solved all his problems, and he's going to play a5, a4 next to blast open the queen side. So I think knight d4 was a really good choice, and after capturing to go f4, just defend the pawn on e5. But in that case you can develop, and the bishop on b2 becomes really bad. Bishop on c5 is the one who locks down the bishop on b2. And let's say if king b1 you can even castle, but you might wait for it. You can play a5 as well. And without a bishop on b2 in the play, I think it's tough to organize some attack. But Andreikin plays this move, and now Giri went for knight g5. He needs to kick this knight away as soon as possible, to go for h6 or bishop e7. white wants to play h6 himself. And in that case, queen f4 might be a big issue. But even then, f5 is a strong one. So if black plays h6 here, white goes back to e4, and what do you do? Knight d6 comes next because the knight on a5 hangs. You can take on e4, but after this, the d file opens up, and the only chance that black has is to go for c4, but you can just step away from the pin. And now the opening up of the c file is not in black's favor, because after capturing, and now rook c3 is the threat, losing the knight in the end. Well, you can always go knight c6, but let's just defend the pawn on b5. And after this, you go back to g3, and this g7 pawn is a huge weakness. Pawn structure is symmetrical, so black cannot launch anything special on the queen side. And black's king is just stuck in the center. There's no way for the king to go, because you can't move the bishop. You need to ruin the castle by moving the rook to defend the g7 pawn, but then bishop e7 doesn't make any sense. And also the d7 pawn is quite weak. So the position is just really uncomfortable, because white also might just go f4, f5 and open up the king side. But in this position, Andreikin played bishop p7. Now Giri improves his rook by rook g3. And now it's too risky to castle because of knight e4 and knight f6 next. This is just insane to do. After knight e4, I don't really believe that black can survive this. Even in this case, h6 doesn't work, because there is just lots of pressure on the g7 pawn, and after taking and going c4, let's say the king steps away, you might go for rook g8, or I think rook g8 is the best here. In the long run, I feel like it should collapse. After f4 and slowly improving, bishop e2, queen e3. He played c4 in the game, and it led to plenty of trouble. Now Giri took on c4, bc4. Again, h6 was better to include, but this was more principled. bc4 and now b4. Giri doesn't want to open up the position, and he does this. Now if the knight moves to c6, there is just capturing on c4, and you cannot take on e5 because you take and queen d7. After this, you can take it, and this appears to be only one check. Queen d2, and if he goes back to d4, bishop d3. Black is a piece down, so that doesn't work. So after knight c6, bishop c4, if you take on b4, I just capture as white. And after this, you take on d7, take on b7. So Andreikin was in trouble here, and he played h6, hoping for trade. If you take on a5, I take on g5, and we're all good. And now Giri took on f7, which led to very interesting position. But actually he would be winning if he went for knight h3. White just wins the pawn. The knight goes back to c6. Bishop captures on c4, and white is a pawn up, and it's not clear how does black make any counterplay. Like I mentioned before, you cannot capture like this because of this and queen d7 and losing the bishop. If you take with the rook, you have back rank issues. If queen a4, just king d2, or let's say this check, bishop d3 or rook d3 even, that's just it. So after bishop c4, you cannot even go for knight b4, like I said before, because of this, queen c4 and losing the bishop on b7. But he chose to play other move, which wins the pawn, but it ruins the queen side. He plays knight f7, and after this, he took on a5. Now he has double pawns on the queen side. The king can be a bit weak at some moments. And now bishop d5. Blocking the d-file. Here, just to mention that bishop g5 is premature, since white has this, takes and queen takes d7. The queen trade won't work because of losing the bishop, and if king g8, then white captures on e6, and after queen f7, bishop c4. Black will give back the material, because if rook c4, then rook d8 and you lose the queen. So actually you have to go for let's say queen e6, bishop e6, and something like this, which is awful. With a billion pawns down, it's just hopeless. ba5, and now bishop d5, very clever move. Queen f4 by Giri, trying to use his queen, and now Andreikin plays the more logical move, king g8. But it's not the best one. The better one is to play king e8, but that seems quite insane to allow this, because you lose the g7 pawn, and what happens in that case? Well, black can play rook f8, and now c3 is a threat. How does white face this? The good thing for black is that he always has d8 as an escape. So actually, white has two forcing moves. One of them is rook e7, and after king takes, queen h4, king e8, and bishop c3, which might lead to some complications, since the bishop can come to b4 and pose some serious issues. It's unpleasant, but it should be okay. And the second choice is queen takes h6, but then it allows c3 and it forces white to go for some perpetual. After rook e7 takes queen g5, the bishop is just dead on b2. There's no way that it can come alive. King e8, and maybe the last chance to go for something is bishop d3, to go for bishop g6 and to at least pin the rook. cb2, and after king b1, white is a rook down, but how does black survive this? Well, one of the ways is to open up the king by d6, and now what's important for black is that he has some pressure on c2, and the bishop cannot leave. Let's say if you give a check like this, he goes to f7, and now there's no rook lift, which might finish the game on the spot, because the c2 pawn is under attack. And now white just has to be happy with the draw after this, and queen g5. Because if you give black more time, he will play rook f7 and somehow organize a defense. King e8 was better objectively, but it was very scary for black, especially in this line, rook g7, rook f8, rook e7, and allowing all this. Bishop c3, bishop b4, this looks quite scary. He went to g8, and again Giri had some chance to seize the advantage. But here he took on d5, and now the idea was, after ed, to capture on g7, take and go e6, with the checkmate in the few moves. After this, queen f7 checkmate. But let's first mention what was the better choice for Giri. After king g8, the better one was to play queen g4, and now, logically, rook h7, and now just bishop e2. If black captures on a5, rook c3, with the idea of going for bishop d3, bishop g6. Also, with rook c3 you attack the c4 pawn, so that's also quite nice. The rook on h7 is very misplaced. After rook d5, the game becomes even more interesting, because after bishop g5, and now white has to give up two exchanges. So very soon we'll have a position with two bishops against two rooks. The endgame you don't see every day. Now Giri took on g5, hg, and now queen d4. White should have gone with queen c4 and made his life easier. And after queen c4, bishop c4, if you take on c4, then rook d7, and white has plenty of pawns for the exchange. So it's better just to take the second exchange like this, but it's not easy to target any pawns in white's camp, because if you target any pawn, the bishop is going to be there to defend it. Actually, this advantage of two exchanges doesn't mean too much. You can go bishop d4, rook c7, and then just g4. And actually, black's pawns are the ones who are target. After rook hc8, you give a check here and fix the pawn by a6, and it can become quite iffy, because if you imagine king d2, c3 being played, now the a7 pawn can become bridged by bishop b7, and you capture a7, and who knows what happens next. You might even lose as black. So after rook g5, hg, queen d4 was played, trying to keep the queens, and now ed5. Andreikin just takes the second exchange, queen d5, and now king f8. I don't like king h7 so much, because it leads black to the corner, and the bishop might become the aggressor. After e6, queen f4 maybe. You don't want to capture on e6 because of queen e4 and couple of checks after king f8, let's say. Or if he goes back to h7, I don't know, just bishop c4 and then bishop d3 back, because if you take, there is this and checkmate. So actually if you go to h7, you just lose the pawn, bishop d3 comes next, and it's becoming really unpleasant. So after king f8, bishop c3, bishop b4 comes next. You give a check, but white escapes. And now you have to take it. What is this? 6 versus 4, but these pawns will be huge targets. But after e6, you don't capture, you just go queen f4. Give a check first. King b1, and now take on e6, because now after queen e6 you can organize some kind of defense also on c4 and g7. The bishop becomes more passive, and white has to repeat moves. After bishop c4 takes, and now this repetition of moves. Andreikin chose a safer move, king f8, and now bishop d4, which forces the queen trade after queen c6. Takes, and now bishop e2. And we have something similar which I showed you a couple of minutes ago. The endgame, 2 bishops versus 2 rooks. When you don't have so many open files, it's not easy for rooks to work together or to work at all. Black's pawn structure is very bad. 5 pawns, 5 different pawn islands. You have this one, you have this one, you have this one, this one. Every single pawn is a target. And that's why Andreikin plays a6. And now king d2, trying to get the king active. King e7, king c3. Now the c4 pawn becomes a target, but luckily white cannot capture because of the potential doubling on the c file. So rook b8 by black, trying to get his rook active. And now a4, trying to stop rook b5. And after bishop f3, they agree to a draw, which seems like very reasonable option for both sides. It's not so clear how would this endgame finish. I feel like it can go both ways. Yeah, that's why Andreikin accepted / offered the draw, because it's not so clear how to proceed here. If you go rook c8, I go bishop b6 is white, and now I want to go bishop b7, take on a6, and take as many pawns as I can. If rook a1, bishop b7. And eventually you have a trade a4 for a6, but if you go here, bishop a6, rook a4, bishop c7, not bishop c4 because of rook c8, bishop c7, rook a8, but now I think that eventually black is on the better side of a draw, because he can sacrifice the exchange, and this is not something that black can lose. But also, how does white lose this one? After rook a4, there is bishop b4, king e5, king b3, and now the remaining pawns are quite weak. Bishop f8 might come next.
Before I go, I want to ask you to check out what happens if black takes on b4. What happens if rook takes b4? Let me know in the comment section what you think. That's it. Thanks so much for watching, and see you soon. Bye.